This is the More to the Story podcast with Andy Miller. I am coming to you live right now on YouTube from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. Now, I'm never quite sure when I'm actually live, when I go live. I don't have a director, believe it or not. I don't have a director behind me saying 3, 2, 1, and you're live. But I think we are rolling here. And I am so glad that you have come along. If you don't know about the More Story podcast, we have approximately 300 episodes. You can find that at andymiller3rd.com. That's andymiller3rd.com. Some people ask me why I emphasize the third. Well, it's because I love my dad and I love my grandfather. And some people confuse me with them. Or even now, my son and his praise band has a podcast called the Praiselandia podcast, and he's Andy Miller IV. And then there's another Andy Miller who works in an organization connected to the institutions that I love, and that is Andrew B. Miller with the Seedbed. And so he's a friend of mine as well. So all of those emails get all mixed up. So I like to just clarify that I'm Andy Miller III. And that was also an open domain name when I registered a website. So you can find at my website about 300 past podcast articles. There's courses there that are available too. I say courses, not anything where you have to have a test, but just information that we share. I have a study on the book of Jude, a study on heaven, a study on holiness. These are things that people can use in small group situations, Sunday school classes. So you can find that at my website as well. And I want you to know too, that this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we do that through many programs. We have more than 600 students from all over the world currently doing some sort of academic program that will equip them to serve in local churches. We do that through bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees. We also have a course of study program for people in the Global Methodist Church. We have a program called the Wesley Institute, which is just regular seminary content with no tests and no certificate that comes with it. But if people want to just have access to some of the things we're doing here, you can find all that at wbs.edu. And then you can also sign up for my email list at my website, which I said earlier, andymiller3rd.com. That's andymiller3rd.com. And if you have been of somebody who's listened to this podcast in the past, this name will be familiar to you. And this person goes way back into the history of the podcast when it was Captain's Corner, when I was serving in the Salvation Army. And so I'm so glad to have back on the podcast my friend, Mark Tooley, who is the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Mark, I almost forgot the name there for a second, but welcome back to the podcast, Mark.
Great to be with you, Andy. It's been a long time since I've seen you physically, it seems like, but good to see you online.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to see you too. And I did not introduce you properly because I should have said, particularly here, come from the president's office at Wesley Biblical Seminary, I should have said Dr. Mark Tooley.
Don't forget. Well, that was one of the honors of my life to have received that honorary doctorate from Wesley Biblical last year.
That's right. And it's an honor for us to have give it to you. And so we love being connected to the work that you've done. And it's something that's when I look back at your career and what's happened through the IRD, those are things that represent much of the ethos of WBS and the way we feel called to be Christ ambassadors in the world. So yeah, we want to be connected to you. That's why we wanted to give you that honorary doctorate. It was an easy decision for our board and the faculty to do that.
Well, it was a wonderful time. I hope I have another excuse to come down sometime soon.
I know I need I can't give you another degree, but I'll figure out something to get you.
Okay.
But I'll be up with you soon. One of the things some folks in my audience might be aware of is the John Wesley Center that is run out of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. They'll be hosting another Wesley Summit this January, and I'll be participating in that, as will many faculty from WBS. Some of you might know that Dr. Ryan Danker leads that. They will be focusing this time on Wesleyans in Scripture. So I know that's just one of the things that you do. Maybe some people in my audience, so Mark, aren't familiar with the IRD. Could you kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of what the IRD does?
It's an ecumenical Christian think tank in Washington, D.C. that's been around since 1981. I've been here since 1994, so almost forever. But it was founded back during the Cold War when the mainline church groups under the uh, aegis of liberation theology were supporting, shockingly, Marxist revolutionary groups as the best way to express gospel solidarity with the poor. So IRD's founders said no, the church, first of all, is not primarily a political instrument, but when it does speak politically, it should be on behalf of human rights and religious freedom for all people, not for dictatorships like those that were persecuting Christians and other persons of conscience. So those are our origins, but we still make arguments, Christian arguments for democracy, human rights, religious freedom for all people. And we believe that strong churches are essential for strong democracy. Strong churches require orthodox, robust theology.
Wonderful. Yeah. And you do that when on the strong churches side, you have a few different programs, and you've had different programs through the years that have influenced mainline denominations. You want to highlight those a little bit for us?
We used to have programs in the United Methodist, Presbyterian Church USA, and Episcopal churches working for reform and renewal in those denominations, and also collaborating with traditionalists in the other mainline churches, all of which were battling over the issue of sexuality for several decades. And of course, those debates concluded over the last 20 and 10 years. The United Methodist Church was the last of the mainline churches to conclude its debate. And all of those debates were, I don't want to say they were won by the progressives.
Right.
But the progressives ended up retaining control, which they had already had for many decades, of the mainline denominations. But there were schisms in all the mainline denominations, and new denominations more adhering to orthodoxy emerged. The best outcome, arguably, was for the Orthodox in the United Methodist Church, in that we did vote in a mechanism for congregations to leave with their property. So it's almost a miracle of God that nearly 8,000 congregations were able to escape with their property from the United Methodist Church, about half of whom have joined the new Global Methodist Church.
Yes. And my idea is that probably as history is written, there'll be several names that will be connected to that movement that gave the opportunity for there to be that kind of conversation and political maneuvering. And I say that in the best possible sense, when we realize that those churches, 8,000 churches, were able to get out of the United Methodist Church, likely your name and organization will be brought up. Now, some people say that in a divisive way, but to me, that's why we believe that the president of the IRD should have an honorary doctorate, because that was a bold thing that often there just wasn't the maybe the experience or the opportunity to think at a level that is beyond the local church, on behalf of the local church, which you all did. And I think that that's one of the great blessings. I mean, I wouldn't say unsung heroes, but somebody working for orthodoxy behind the scenes was you, Mark, and our great appreciation to the work that you did in helping to even expose. I mean, it was helpful to me to know what was happening in the United Methodist Church, just reporting the pure facts of what was going on there. So really thankful for that work. And I guess now, do you see that continuing with the theological influence that you have with the John Wesley Center?
Yes, thank you, Andy, for those complimentary words. And it was the great honor of my life to have labored in that task from the time I graduated from college till just a few years ago. So virtually my entire adult life. And yes, there is a continuity. IRD no longer has denominational action programs, but we do have our John Wesley Institute working for theological formation on behalf of Wesleyan beliefs across denominations or even outside denominations. And as you know, we are working in a very different reality in American Christianity. When I was growing up, if you were Protestant, you belonged to a denomination. It might be mainline Protestant, it might be Southern Baptist, it might be some other tradition. But now the trend is entirely towards non-denominational. And so we have to reach those people too with the importance of Wesleyan theology.
Amen. Yes, that's something we've been looking at at WBS. Now we've grown in exponentially in the last few years. Just in the last 3 years, we've more than doubled in our student body and our FTEs and number of credits being purchased. That's largely to do with the emergence of the Global Methodist Church. But what we've also found is that there are people who are looking for what Wesleyan institutions can offer, but they don't necessarily understand themselves as Wesleyans. So we did a research study with Tom and Sam Rayner at Church Answers. And we actually had some Lilly funding to do this. And this might seem a little tongue in cheek, but the study was we were analyzing a market and identifying if there was a market that we called biblical but not yet Wesleyan. Biblical but not yet Wesleyan. So people who would maybe have an Arminian orientation or soteriologically, and also probably have some openness to women in leadership in the life of the church, and hold a high view of Scripture. So we found and have identified this market. And so we're now aggressively pursuing that in the similar way, like, because it's not going to be like seminaries won't find future students just by connecting with denominations. It's going to come as we present our theology and message and our formative experiences as something that's available, and if we connect that almost directly to the people who are looking for it, as opposed to the traditional denominational kind of outpost that we've had as a foundation.
So you're searching for the unconscious Wesleyans out there.
Maybe that's a better way of saying it. Yeah. We think more people are Wesleyan than realize it. And
absolutely. They just need to be informed.
That's right. And I think a lot of people even in the Baptist tradition, there's a lot of Arminians in the Baptist world, and a lot of even Calvinist Baptists Reformed Baptists who preach like Arminians.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And in American Christianity, it's a joke, but it's also mostly true that non-denominational means Baptist by another name. And so we want to keep Wesleyan beliefs alive and vibrant as an important part of American Christianity. And of course, Christian intellectual life, on the Protestant side, is dominated by our Calvinist friends.
Right.
And they bring many, many strengths to the table with their strong tradition. But we want Wesleyans there. And so that's why we need Wesley Biblical Seminary, the John Wesley Institute, and the several other strong Orthodox Wesleyan seminaries in America.
And I know you've had many calls, and we've had these conversations before, looking for Wesleyan political theologians. And I think that's coming. I think, like, with this research, I wish it could be there for you now. And also like church planting too. Just know, while we're not talking about it here, I'm just praying that God will send a church planter to Washington, D.C. for you, like for this area.
He needs to do it. Wesleyans are sorely underrepresented in the nation's capital, which debatably might be the most important city in the world. So
there you go.
It needs to be here. And it will stay.
Well, I bring it up here just because I'm maybe somebody will listen to this and sense the Holy Spirit leading them to do just that. So you know who to call, folks. He's got property and everything, even a couple of church pews in his building. So
we can provide the pews. You have to provide the preaching.
There you go. Well, Mark, one of the things that was really helpful after I had left seminary, and I don't want to fault, people will know where I went to seminary. So, and I think there might even be a difference now. I didn't receive like a political foundation for thinking about the way Christians should operate in society. If anything, I received, it would have come from the Anabaptist tradition, because I think Methodists, and I say Methodist, Wesleyans in general, would try to say, well, who's speaking about how we should vote and how we should operate in society, how we should think about war. They went to somebody maybe from a Wesleyan institution like Duke. And I found a lot of what I received in my theological education was influenced by Stanley Hauerwas. And this type of emphasis was consistent. And that was what I tried to adopt. But essentially, like, I found this wasn't working. This wasn't. And you, in your resources that you've provided, introduced me to Christian realism. And so this was outside of any theological education, and Niebuhr, and thinking about how Christians can operate in society. And I really appreciate that. And that's like a part of my own story, is the way that you kind of pointed me even before we knew each other, to these type of resources. And recently, you're helping me think again about the way there has been an influx of anti-Semitism even in the church. And so you have a recent article you published on Christian anti-Semitism, particularly as it has been platformed by Tucker Carlson and with the influence of Nick Fuentes. So I was just interested in you kind of like observing this trend that you see. And I wanted just to chat with you about this concern. Is this something you've seen coming? Because it caught me off guard, I'll be quite honest.
It's been coming slowly, but it seemed to especially explode into the national conversation just over the last few weeks. There's a think tank here in Washington called the Heritage Foundation, conservative think tank, the largest in Washington, and they have a relationship with Tucker Carlson, the commentator, who had recently interviewed in a very uncritical way this Nick Fuentes, who is very explicit in his antipathy towards Jewish people. And so that led to a big national conversation, but especially here in DC, in terms, is there anti-Semitism? We talk about anti-Semitism on the secular left, but is it now on the political right? And is it even growing among Christians? And the answer is, regrettably, seems to be yes. Nick Fuentes claims to be Christian. He talks
Right.
as Christian. He says Christ is king. Tucker Carlson professes to be Christian. And it turns out there are a lot of young men who partially, if not entirely, subscribe to what Nick Fuentes has to say. So that was a revelation to me. I had seen him as very marginal, but I'm not 23 years old. Uh, Asking 23-year-olds, do you know people who listen to Nick Fuentes? And it turns out, yes, they do. I talked to a professor yesterday at a prominent conservative Christian college, and he said, yes, his young men, they are listening to Nick Fuentes. Now, they would say, oh, it's just for fun. I don't take him too seriously. It's ironic, but it's a very dangerous form of irony.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is very dangerous. I didn't hear about it. You might have seen the expose, so to speak, that Ben Shapiro put forward about Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes. I think I would have told you that name sounds familiar from somebody who's in public conversation, but I don't really know who he is. But I have two teenage boys. They're 18 and 16. They're a senior and junior in high school. And I had them listen to that with me and just to kind of lay this out, to think through what we heard. And that's all I need to hear. I
Mm-hmm.
could hardly, but when the language that comes to mind is moral filth,
Ah,
to describe what I heard on that, and this appreciation and admiration of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, and
yes.
and then at the same time calling on the name of Jesus and white superiority. I mean, it's frightening to me to see that this is making its way into regular circles, and so I my kind of like parental role was to say to my kids, this is not who I want you to be, and this is not who we are. We need to be on guard against all of this.
Were your sons familiar with him
They
previously?
weren't. No,
Yeah.
thankfully they weren't.
Yeah. And do you come across seminarians who maybe are familiar or even follow Fuentes?
That isn't something that I have not kind of pulled our students in that way.
Yeah.
I think there's just a general awareness of him, but
Mm-hmm.
by the time you get to a seminary, maybe it's like you have a different type of student. Maybe then you say at undergraduate Christian college might have more people who would be in that demographic.
Well, that's certainly true. And there was an article yesterday that's been much discussed nationally by Rod Dreher, a commentator who was in DC over the last week talking to Republican staffers who told him they thought 40% of the young staffers working on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in the government were somehow aligned with Fuentes or flirting.
Interesting.
That seems extraordinarily high. And someone pointed out, well, certainly the women are not listening to him. So how could it be 40%? But even if it's just half of that, if it's 20%, that's shockingly high.
Absolutely. It even is just anecdotal. Obviously, it's not empirically driven, but there's
Right.
something to so Mark, why don't you outline for us what you think, what I said a few things, but the alarm bells that go off for you and what you hear in that messaging.
Well, the preamble to a lot of this is that the traditional Christian gatekeepers are largely gone or irrelevant, and that's related to the decline of denominations and the fact that Christianity in America is far more individualized now. And even those who are actively going to churches, whether they're in denominations or in non denominational churches, the pastor doesn't exercise the influence he once had over congregations. And your typical Christian is very online and listening to podcasters, watching YouTubers, and collating his or her own preferences in terms of what they're absorbing politically and religiously. And so, whereas 20 years ago they would have had such access and they would have been giving a lot more attention to pastor or denominational publications or traditional Christian books they would pick up at the local Christian bookstore. All of that has been nearly swept away, and it's just the wild, wild west. And so people like Fuentes or 1,000 others can sweep in, and almost overnight they have 1 million followers and they become national figures. And maybe older people like you and I have no idea who these people are, much less that they have 1 million followers. And so it catches us by surprise.
Yeah. So if you could, if you had a little bit of time, like just 2 minutes with somebody who was saying, yeah, I'm kind of interested in that message. I'm not taking it too seriously. What would you say is the most dangerous aspects of what you hear from Fuentes and this so-called Christian anti-Semitism?
Obviously, for Christians, any kind of hatred or racial prejudice or disdain for any kind of people group is absolutely unacceptable. But the disdain for Jewish people often is a special kind of poison because they're often the target of projection or conspiracy theories. The world is wrong. I am a victim. I am aggrieved because of what they are doing, the control that they have. They have all of this power that they are exploiting behind the scenes. And if we could sweep them away, it would be a much better world. It's a very dangerous perspective. And it's also, well, it's goes against the teachings of Christianity in many ways, but certainly it goes against our sense of personal responsibility. Why is the world corrupt? Well, you and I, as sinners, are contributing to the
Right.
problems of the world. And chiefly, we begin with the renewal of ourselves and not by projecting or claiming that some people group other than ourselves, they're to blame for all or most of the problems.
Yes, absolutely. So there's this sense too of denying the image of God in others. And then obviously, I think the victimhood mentality, I think this is a type of thing that we want to be very careful of when we think of the dangers of what some have identified as critical theory. Is and sometimes putting people in the place of seeing themselves as victim, and therefore even back to your work, Mark, thinking of Marxist influences in the 1980s. What was like this victimhood reality that would then put ourselves in a position of needing to have systemic responses to injustice. And so then this would again then work from the perspective of victimhood. And it's like they're operating initially out of that concern. And so you can kind of see this like we're the ones all of a sudden, or Christians are the ones who are marginalized. And then that calls upon them to act in sinful ways that deny the image of God in other people.
Well, it's a wonderful liberation to be a victim because therefore you don't have to reflect on your own sins and your own
Right.
failings. You just point the finger at others.
Absolutely. Yeah. I I think if we look at this and we look at the call to love our neighbor. Now, some people would say that if you love your neighbor, you have to identify and keep all of the same political perspectives as somebody else. Well, I think this is moving far beyond that. It seems fairly clear that these are, I would say, I've been cautious with the language of hate, but it seems like hate is at the center of a lot of what's coming here with the enmity towards groups of people.
Well, yes, and we have seen the special kind of threat that anti-Semitism poses in societies when they go down that path, and it ends up being poisonous for everyone. And well, the ultimate example, obviously, is Nazi Germany, but there is this strange connection between tyranny and dictatorship and anti-Semitism. The Soviet Union had it. Obviously, Islamist societies have it. It's very difficult to sustain a constructive, healthy democracy where all have equal rights when anti Semitism is a very strong force.
Yeah. Do you just thinking about what's happening in New York City with the election of their mayor? Now, this is on the other side. This is on the political right, but the political left. I know that's one of the concerns that arises there as well. Is that same perspective of somebody who says the government has the answers to all of our problems, um, and it seems to also be connected to a negative view of Israel and a certain form of anti-Semitism.
It certainly can be, and many often respond, oh, you can certainly be critical of the government of Israel without being anti Semitic. Obviously, that's the case, but those who are obsessively critical of Israel to the exclusion of the rest of the world, if there's a unique preoccupation with Israel and its failings, often there are some disturbing underlying reasons. IRD did a analysis report about 15 years ago of mainline and ecumenical church pronouncements about human rights in other nations over the previous decade, and found that the liberal mainline agencies and the ecumenical groups they were a part of, 90% of their human rights critiques around
Mm.
the world were focused on Israel, not North Korea, not China, not Iran or Saudi Arabia, but democratic Israel. So were they anti-Semitic? Were they just simply anti-Western, anti-democratic? I don't know. But when you're focusing on Israel's failures, 90% of the time, there's an issue there.
Yeah. In general, like what I've said to people and students is I don't so I don't I have a positive disposition generally toward Israel, but that isn't related to scripture, except for the call to love neighbor and to see ordered society as something that is good, and democracy as a system that can help us will the good for others. So like it's actually not been a I don't uh, have a positive disposition towards Israel because of like a pre-theological decision, but it is more or less a strategic statecraft decision for my support of Israel. I'm curious where you see you shaking your head there, but that's generally been the way that I've tried to position this. This isn't about if I do something good for Israel, God will do something good for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, many critics of Israel have a special antipathy for American evangelicals, whom they deem quote unquote Christian Zionist, and therefore supposedly they advocate supporting Israel no matter what the circumstances, because there's going to be some kind of cosmic eternal reward for Christians who are pro Israel. You've hit the jackpot. And there are different schools of thought in terms of Christian attitudes towards a restored national Israel. The one that's most discussed, of course, is dispensationalism that developed in the 19th century and became very prominent in the 20th century. It seems to be and your listeners know about dispensationalism because it focuses on the rapture and the end times and the restoration of Israel as a state. Sort of sets off the clock towards the return of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. But that perspective seems to be in decline among American Christians, and I very rarely come across Christians under the age of 50
Oh
who
no, yeah.
are really plugged into dispensationalism. So, what's replacing it? At least dispensationalism, whatever you think of it, it did contain or hold back anti Semitism or hostility to Israel. So, at least it was somewhat constructive in that fashion. As it recedes, what will replace it? Ideally, it would be a thoughtful uh, attitude towards Israel, that it's an ally of the United States, democratic, We wish them well, and certainly we wish Jewish people well, and certainly in America, we affirm them as equal citizens in every way, and we oppose any kind of religious discrimination in civil life. But we live in an era where, speaking broadly simply about being civil or human rights for all people, has less and less traction, especially for young men who are looking for a harder, more high octane message. And if they're Christian, they want a more hardline theology. So there again, that's the appeal of someone like Fuentes, or those who maybe aren't as extreme as he is, but who are supposedly really speaking their mind in an uninhibited way, in ways that their local pastor never would. And so once again, that's part of the draw of these strong online personalities who seem to have no boundaries.
Right. Yeah, that's there definitely seems to be an appeal to the strong online personality. I guess that's why I don't have a million followers, Mark. I
You
need to work on that.
need to get nastier to get that follow.
Yeah, that's right. It's almost like like looking at a traffic accident. Like, yeah, you drive by, you can't help it. It just looks, it's awful. It's just a awful description of what's happening in society. And for somebody to be that bold to say, if people go back in my podcast archives, you see, I had a conversation, well, two that come to mind. One with Daniel Hummel, who is a historical theologian. Oh, good. You're shaking your head. So he has a book, a wonderful book published by Urbans called The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. And he's been a friend to me. I've interacted. We actually both have a significant interest in the 19th century. Oh, there you go. I got mine here too. Well, won't. Hey, we should just let them know that we both got them. So, yeah, and this excellent book. But and the other one I would say is Crawford Gribben's work. If you know of Crawford Gribben, who's a Scottish historical theologian, who comes from, I think he actually comes from a Brethren background, though I'm not sure. I don't know where he is theologically, but he has a book published by Oxford University Press last year on John Nelson Darby, on the historical roots of dispensationalism. And he says that it's very interesting. And it was very convicting to me just reading a few academic articles that he wrote on Darby and then this book. I had never read anything in John Nelson Darby. And kind of like the typical line is, oh, well, Darby, all this traces back to Darby. And Gribben shows that that Darby isn't really the father of dispensationalism. If anything, he could be called the grandfather of dispensationalism. The roots there, but many times people haven't read this, and so I think there's a bit of a surprise for folks to find out that the straw man of John Nelson Darby and supposedly dispensationalism probably isn't what they think. And so it's a kind of a quick way to find a solution that's not probably connected to the real historical sources. But then on top of that, like what we see here in Daniel Hummel's work is there's a lessening, kind of a softening of dispensationalism that is hardly present even at this, like you said, it may be, so there's kind of remnants of it. And you see some of this maybe in somebody like Ted Cruz, but it's not, and I have a lot of appreciation for Ted Cruz, but at the same time, pointing to dispensationalism, and it seems like, and you have an article on this too, that some people think that appreciation for Israel as a state and as a democracy is somehow connected to dispensationalism and people like me and you.
Well, that's right. And those who aren't as old as I have a hard time comprehending the hold that dispensationalism had on a big part of American Christianity. But even in my local United Methodist Church when I was a boy, I recall as an acolyte, one year I was given as a gift for my services a copy of Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, which is kind of a Bible of dispensationalism about the end times. And during the 1980s, Pat Robertson on television every day with the 700 Club, explaining how unfolding events in the Middle East, this was all a fulfillment of prophecy, and he would walk you through the dispensationalist calendar. And so almost all of that is now gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's. I think sadly the way that I see it, and this is what we see in students. So people do come to us, and the generic belief in evangelicalism, even in evangelical humor, is in a rapture. But I have a book coming out next spring on heaven, hell, and everything in between with seedbed, and I have a note there just indicating like you would think if there's a conservative school in the Wesleyan tradition, uh, I'm sitting in it, right, Wesley? And there wouldn't be a faculty member here, an adjunct faculty member that would affirm a rapture. So, but what's happened is there's a conflation between Jesus's second coming and the rapture. And so this is something that generally we're able to work through with students. And once they begin just to have a biblical theology, read a good systematic theology, they start to like figure out, oh, okay, these two things aren't connected. But it does take some work because that's what's in the water, so to speak.
Yes, it is. It still is, and I suppose it was dispensationalism was always much bigger among Baptist and Pentecostals than it was among Methodist and Wesleyans, but certainly it did bleed over. And I still have Methodist friends who would just take for granted that about the rapture and other elements of dispensationalist thought. They didn't get it in their Methodist church; they just absorbed it in other ways.
Yeah, what I encourage people to think is like you can reject dispensationalism, but that doesn't mean that you also have to reject a view of Israel. And I think that that's where you're going at with your article about Christian Zionism as a heresy. So there is, well, again, somebody else from the Heritage Foundation had posted something about this. I'm trying to recall the exact thing. But you want to, do you see that same sort of influence coming through even in DC in the think tank world?
Yes, at a all hands on deck staff meeting at the Heritage Foundation amid this Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes controversy. I believe it was a young woman stood up to tell the president of the Heritage Foundation that she, as a Catholic, could not buy into Christian Zionism, which her church would see as a heresy. Once again, conflating Christian Zionism with dispensationalism. You can be a devout Roman Catholic and still affirm Israel. Documents from popes in the Vatican would affirm the right of Israel to exist. But once again, that conflation is ongoing, and it takes a lot of explaining to say, oh, Christians can support Israel without being dispensationalist.
So would you call yourself a Christian Zionist?
I think if a Christian Zionist is a Christian who affirms Israel as a Jewish state, then yes. And there are many forms of Christian Zionism. It's always existed. There are even some statements from John and Charles Wesley that would arguably imply they were, in some sense, Christian Zionists. They saw the Jews returning to the land of Israel. They were liberal Protestants who were Christian Zionists. Reinhold Niebuhr, sort of the architect of modern Christian realism, was a Christian Zionist, not because he was a dispensationalist or saw it as a fulfillment of prophecy. He saw it as a matter of biblical justice, especially after what had happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. The same for Martin Luther King, outspokenly Christian Zionist, not because he was a dispensationalist or saw it as a fulfillment of prophecy, but the Jews were a suffering people who needed to have their own land for their own protection as a matter of justice.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful to hear you say that and to lay those pieces out historically. I know that if we could spend all time a long time looking at those details if we had the time to do that. I know that even there's some premillennialism is another thing that often gets conflated with dispensationalism. There is what David Bebbington identifies as historic premillennialism, which is unconnected to a dispensationalist model. So somebody like, say, a well-known Wesleyan like Ben Witherington would hold that view and also still hold um, a, a place for the people of Israel in the sense that there might be something in the eschaton, like maybe a, I don't know if he would say these words, so I don't want to put those in, but some historic premillennialists would say there's like another opportunity for the people of Israel, maybe based upon Romans 9 through 11, thinking of that. So like there is these other ways through this beyond thinking about Israel as a nation and the Jews as a people beyond dispensationalism. I think that's what I highlight is that premillennialism is not necessarily associated with dispensationalism. Christian Zionism is not necessarily associated with that.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, and is it accurate to say that Methodism largely has been amillennial for most of its history?
uh, I wouldn't say that. I would think that his historic premillennialism is more dominant in the 19th century than is often assumed.
Hmm.
So some people would assume there is a post millennialism, but I found in my own research that that's not often easy to identify. Just because somebody has a positive view of the world or a call to so-called win the world for Jesus, that's
Mhm.
not necessarily a post millennial statement, particularly if you think of the fact that millennialism then is connected to the parousia, or when Jesus will return. So generally they're like historic premillennialism, and say in somebody like the 19th century evangelical leader, the seventh Earl of Shaftesbury, and people like that, they start to emphasize the kind of the need for a cataclysmic moment of return to solve the world's problems with the return of Jesus. That would then the millennium would come. Well, that wasn't connected to a rapture. That wasn't connected to anything like that. So I find a lot of people in the Wesleyan world were more what Bebington calls historic premillennialist.
You think John Wesley was amillennial?
That's a very debated point. I think I think that it's inconsistent. I don't think you can say with John Wesley or 19th century holiness movement authors. I don't think you can. There's easily pinned down as maybe the secondary literature has suggested.
Mm.
So I do think that by the time you get to 20th century, in somebody like Henry Clay Morrison, you begin to have influence of Pentecostalism and the American Bible Conference movement. You start to have premillennialism. So for instance, the Christian Missionary Alliance, which has Wesleyan connections at its beginning, had as one of its key beliefs premillennialism, and Henry Clay Morrison wrote a book called The Optimism of Premillennialism. So it starts to become a part of the early evangelical Wesleyan uh, structure in the 20th century. But I think in the 19th century, it's often identified as that. And somebody like Mark Olson has done a lot of work showing how Wesley could be on either side of the millennium question. So sorry, you open up a can of worms there, but I'm very interested in the subject.
And I have to ask you, the Booze, the founder of the Salvation Army.
Yeah, so this I'm hopeful that my dissertation will be published soon, but has often been William Booth has often been categorized as a post millennialist.
Mhm.
But and I have peer reviewed articles where where I say that, and sadly, then when I went to do my own research in the archives, I found far too much material where he'd be identified as it could be any of the options. So where's at times where even Booth adopted a dispensational model and advocated for rapture, times where he sounded like a postmillennialist, times where he sounded like a historic premillennialist. And
Mm.
there's even an article where he sounds like a millennialist. So he's
Uh,
all over the map.
yeah, kept his options open.
That's right. Well, and he wouldn't, I think he was just kind of like was picking up what was in the water at the time. Interesting
Yeah.
enough, Booth went to Israel too. And this was like
Mm.
in the early 1900s too. So, but it wasn't connected, of course, to any of these sort of movements.
Well, there was a lot of excitement in those days because the Ottoman Empire seemed to be collapsing. And so, for the first time, there was a real opportunity for there to be a Jewish state. So, I'm sure he was caught up in the frenzy like so many others.
Yeah. And there was a definite, I mean, he wanted there to be like a Salvation Army in Israel. But that was just a part of his desire for the world to be one for Jesus. And a lot of people have said that that desire is post millennial because, like, but the conversion of the world is a theme that's picked up in various traditions, again, Pentecostal traditions as well, that are explicitly premillennial as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Well,
thanks for going down that road with me. I'm,
that,
I'm always interested to talk about that. But
that,
Mark,
that
I'd love to get you any last words here, thinking about the influence of the so-called, I hardly want to call it Christian anti-Semitism. I hate putting that word in front of it because
yeah.
it's not Christian. These two things are not compatible.
I would like to think that Wesleyan Christianity is somewhat less susceptible to the influence of anti-Semitism, and so hopefully we can be out there rejecting it and making the good arguments against it. But nobody is immune, and in fact, the article I wrote that you cite, I recall a speech by a very prominent Methodist church leader in the 1920s to the General Conference, where terribly he talks of the Jews as being this race of people who are corrupt and distrusted, no matter where in what nation they find themselves. And it's just shocking to think that he gave this explicit anti-Semitic speech at a General Conference of America's largest denomination with seemingly without any repercussion. So that was a different day, but we're not inoculated against that. We have to. This is a perennial battle.
Yes. I'm sad that is the case. I'm sad it has to be a
Yes.
perennial battle, but we have to fight for this with the and honestly, from an evangelistic perspective, I hope that people who are Jewish will sense a movement to want to come to Christ, but it's certainly not going to happen if we use this reprehensible language and deny their humanity and want them eliminated. And so there's that side of it, but I just trust that God can be at work and help us to be able to identify this clear evil. And that's what I wanted to do here. I appreciated you speaking out on this, and I wanted to do my best to kind of contribute. This is not Christianity. And this is something we need to stand against. And I pray that, those of you who are in my audience will push against these ideas, pastors to preach against these ideas and to uphold the sanctity of human life, just like we would when we bring up abortion, just like we stand up for the complementary nature of the human body. Let's keep this going also in the way that we treat those created in God's image who are Jewish. Mark, I probably asked you this question before when you've been on, but my podcast is called More of the Story. Is there more of the story of Mark Tooley? And we can find a lot of things you do online. Do you have a hobby? Is there something you like to do that you don't talk a lot about?
Well, I talk about it if asked. I do play racquetball, and tennis is my main sports. I'm also
Okay.
a serious walker. I try to do at least 4 miles every day, especially in the streets of Washington, D.C. And I'm a big history buff. I try to get to every available presidential home in the country, and I love Civil War battlefields.
Okay. Well, that's another reason to come back to Mississippi, of course.
Yes. Oh, yeah. A lot of action there.
It's great. Well, Mark, thanks so much for your time today, and appreciate your witness in our nation's capital and all that you're doing with the IRD.
Thank you, Andy. Good to have your Wesleyan voice out there.
We might still be live. So I'm just going to, if we are folks and you're still hanging in here, God bless you. Because we're live, I just have to end the conversation.